Hello, you have reached the process with Dr. John Bush. We are trying to, me, trying to help you win your fantasy football drafts. That's about 60% of uh, the show, as far as I can tell, at least in my experience. We've arrived at lesson 37, Team Analysis Part 3. We're continuing with our team analysis, and one might think that when I say the word team, what are we talking about? Well, obviously there are 32 teams, but also I think in this lesson I wanted to ask the question, what does a good team look like as far as the positions? Okay, so what is it that when we say, oh, we have a good team, I know there's the winning record and etc., the players, but just kind of looking above that, kind of at the landscape level a little bit, what are we really looking at and defining as a good, above average, below average, or poor team? So I think we can start by using this metric here. This is looking at 2013 to 2020 team yearly performances, and I grouped teams that were in the top eight as the best, the next eight above average, the next eight below average, and the bottom eight were the worst teams. So that is cluster A, B, C, and D. And then I looked and used the box and whisker approach to look at the distribution of uh, fantasy points uh, in those teams over that time. So we're talking, what is that, 7 times 8, 56 teams in each is represented in each of these blocks here. And remember, the box and whisker, pretty much 66% of the samples of the data is sitting in the box, and any kind of outliers are shown above or below the box here. So if we look at quarterbacks in green, okay, here's the best teams. You can see right away that those teams having the best quarterbacks did well, right? Look at the worst teams. Compare the worst here. See what this box is versus the best. Big difference. So, people are saying, oh, well, we would have predicted that. Well, okay, would you? Then what about the running backs? That's in blue. And from what I can just visually tell, there's not much difference. Isn't that interesting? So, would you have predicted that? Okay, what about tight ends? Well, that's kind of interesting. Looks like the box here is showing a higher distribution and some higher production values for tight ends on the best teams. Look at the worst, okay, versus the above and below average. So I think there may be something to be said. The best teams will tend to have the best quarterbacks and maybe the best tight ends. Isn't that interesting? What about running backs then? Here's the best. Pretty close, a little bit below, a little bit below, and a little bit below still. So there's a tendency, as I look at the data from best to worst, that worst teams tend to have not very strong wide receivers as well. So I think the surprise to me was, in fact, the running backs. So when I'm then drafting, I'm thinking I'm not so worried about the running backs, at least the top one or two if they're pass catching, but I am going to pay very strong attention to the quarterbacks and maybe the tight ends and the wide receivers a little bit. So it seems to me, just looking at the intensity here, the data, looks like the quarterback is a big difference here, and we see some difference with the tight end, some difference with the wide receiver, and very little difference, maybe a little bit, with the running backs. So I think that's kind of how I would rank that. So when we think of a picture of the best and the worst teams, as far as I've seen out there in the world, I've never seen any kind of analysis like this. And if you stuck with me through all these lessons, you're thinking like I am. Why is it taking me to come in and do this? I think a lot of people that are in the Twitterverse and the experts are not data analysis folks. Okay, they're using their other skills. Okay. So, hey, it is what it is, and I'm trying to play to my strengths. I'm not trying to play to my weakness, okay, which is probably podcasting, right? But anyway, I thought that was very intriguing. I mean, to me, when I saw this data, it's like, woo woo. So this is some woo woo data right here, okay? So I think that kind of gets my head thinking about my drafts here coming up and kind of what I'm thinking about. So I think let's go a little further here. Here's the quarterback, and if we look, so now what I'm doing, and you could probably figure out the rest of the lesson, is we're going to look at each position separately. I showed you kind of everybody as a landscape. Now we're going to look at the positions and using the box whisker method here. And if you saw the last lecture, we talked about the box and whisker. This is about 66% of the teams that were the best teams. Their quarterbacks were producing fantasy points in this range. Take a look at the worst. Wow. Big difference. People say, oh, can a quarterback make a difference? Well, after the fact, the data would suggest yes, it can pull a bad team up. So that's very intriguing if you think about the drafts and you wonder, why are they going so crazy over quarterbacks? I think that's leading the better teams. Okay, here's the averages. Here's the average here, the above average, this X, below average, and then the worst. And you see some outliers, and the big outliers are in the best and the above average. They're having some nice quarterback productions over the 7-year period. I think that's very intriguing. Here's the actual data here, colorized as well. And you're saying, well, what about some of the red over there? It's stats and large numbers and looking across. Not everything is perfect. In other words, if it was perfect, then the best teams would all be colorized in green and would have the best. And that's just not what we see. But the tendency is a lot of green here. I don't see any green in the worst here in the D teams over 7 years. So that's the tendency. And that's about all we can use stats for, is to push us towards or away from trends and tendencies, okay? So if we use our ANOVA, okay, and analysis of variance, and then we'll follow up with the Tukey testing, we'll actually compare these groups and ask the question, is there really a difference? Can we believe that chart, the box and whisker that I just showed you? Here's the median for the best, 194 fantasy points. Here's the worst, 105. So that's almost, what, 90 points difference in average over a year. That's some significant points here. I guess 90 divided by what, 16, whatever that is per game. So every game, every week, the better teams, as far as your PPR teams and your quarterback teams, are getting that much better. So Superflex, you ever wonder why do they always play quarterbacks? Cause if you get two quarterbacks that are producing this much, you have a hell of advantage in Superflex here. So that's why people go, shall I say, ape shit crazy? Yeah, they do. Okay. So we look at the p-value, which tells us, is there a difference if we compare these four groups from the 7 year? And the answer is, oh yeah, big time. It's much lower than 0.05. So it's 1 times 10 to the 16. That's like 16 zeros or something. That's almost impossible that what we saw, that there was not a difference there. And so now what are the differences? Let's look at Tukey. The best teams are better than the above average, their quarterbacks, below average, and the worst. There you go, right there. Chalk it up. Looks to me like, don't wait too late on your quarterback. Remember, people talk about that late quarterback. That's true, but I think you can use the better teams. We talked about prediction of last year's ranks versus this year's. So I think you can kind of get a slate of quarterbacks to go for that are going to give you the statistical advantage here. The above average is not much different than the below average. You see here it's insignificant, but it's better than the worst. And even the above average, below average is better than the worst. So the worst teams have the worst quarterbacks, and that is statistically significantly different than all the other teams. So if you look at last year's rankings of the teams as far as, average fantasy points, the ones that were the crappy at the bottom, unless something dramatic happens in the drafts, I'm not taking those quarterbacks as my QB1, not even close. Okay, I would love to stay certainly in the A group. You might be able to survive with the B group, but I'm not getting much lower than that. So I think you can develop a slate and go into that, and knowing that this is the trend in the stats here. Running backs, what do we got here? Here's the difference. There was some difference. If you look a little bit, it is clear that, the worst teams maybe have the worst running backs. And we'll have the stats here in just a second, and we'll know for sure. I don't know if it's that much different between the other teams, so we'll see. Okay, so I guess when I kind of get an overview, it's a little bit hard to see in that landscape. You're saying, well, how come you didn't know? Well, it's been a while since I've seen the data. So I generate this data probably a month ago, and then I'm now talking about it. Okay, it takes a while, so I forgot. And it looked to me like if you were a crappy team last year in total average fantasy points, I probably don't want their running backs either. But we'll see. We'll use the stats and answer that question here. Here's the average 87 with the best teams 60. So we're talking, what is that, 27 points. So you see, I guess across 16 weeks, maybe that's not so critical. I guess you could say, if you did end up with a running back from one of the worst teams from last year that turned out to be a crappy team this year, you're not in the hole as much as you are if you grab their quarterback. So I think the intensity there, your focus need to be grabbing that quarterback. And certainly the trend is staying away from the worst team running backs as well. Here is the the p value is 13 zeros, 13 zeros. That's way less. So there's a difference. Okay, I bet the worst is really the worst. Let's take a look. Notice that the running backs from the top 8 and the next 8, no different. So in the draft, I'm thinking that I can slide a little bit and take from last year's top 16, assuming, you're thinking they're going to stay in that. But the top 8 running backs, certainly better than the below average and the worst. And the B is, the above is about the same as the below. No difference, but it's really difference in the worst. So I think the take home is you don't, unless you got to have one, unless you're desperate, you don't want running backs from the worst teams that are going to play. So when we talked about predictions of last year's rankings versus this year, do you see how that sets this data up? Okay, big time. You should spend some time considering changes for 2021. Go back and read that lesson again. I didn't say it's written in stone, but the trend is what we talked about, okay, in that lesson. Okay, so to me, it's very intriguing there. And I did add a little bit of data, percentage of top. So if we have the top is 100% in the best team, then your running backs on average are 66% of the best. Okay, and notice the variation is still really high with running backs, and we've seen that before. So when I say top vary, so you get a lot of uncertainty, but you're not taking home a lot of points, right? So you got to gamble here, but it's not worth if you consider the ratio of points to variation. The worst teams are not doing you any favors at all. Tight ends. Let's see what's happening here. Box and whisker. There is a trend. A nice trend, actually. Look at where the best teams tight ends. Their 66% is much higher than the other ones here. And look at even at the worst. The worst best is maybe at the average of the other ones here, and maybe even below the best team. So there's probably going to be this worst team scenario for tight ends. I'm just not sure there's a difference here. We'll find out. Okay, that's why I love the stats. We look at this and we're like, well, is that true? What do we got here? That's why stats says yes or no, kind of. We look at 63% versus 38. So it looks to me like, what is that, 40, what is that, 25 points over a season if you're taking a tight end from the worst teams. A couple points here or there every week. That adds up. Think about it. If you got the quarterback bringing about 9 points extra, the running back maybe 2 or 3 points, the tight end 2 or 3 points. There you go. All of a sudden, you have 10, 13, 14-point advantage over some of your league mates every year if you've grabbed the right ones. Let's see what our stats say. Here's our p-value, 10 to the minus 10. So there's a big difference, and I suspect it's the worst. And guess what? The best tight ends from the top teams are significantly different than all the others. So the top 8 teams this year, their tight ends are going to average more points for you than everybody else. So it is critical to make some conclusions about who do you think the top 8 teams are going to be. We do have last year's rankings as a beginning. Go and look at that lesson. If you're thinking, wow, that team lesson that we talked about previously really important. Yes, it was. That's why I set the foundation. Okay? It's not just random, let me throw some numbers out here and hope something happens. No. Okay? It's all a deliberate trend and plan. Okay? That's how we're building a team. Okay? We're not just flipping around like some on the pile. What are you going to do? I don't know. Hope I did it though. Hope I win. We're not doing hope, okay? Okay, anything can happen week to week. We're just trying to position ourselves to have an advantage coming into the draft, coming out of the draft, and then moving on. That's all I can do. That's all we can hope for. That's why I play 50 leagues a year, okay, or more. Because if you have an advantage, game theory says play as many rounds as possible, right? If you can beat the dice, you should sit there and bet the minimum amount and roll the dice till your hand can't move, okay? By the way, you don't see many people doing that because there's no such thing as a professional dice player if they've got a die, because the house wins, okay? In fact, if you tell Vegas, call them up, say, I got $10,000, I'm the best dice player ever, they'll send you plane tickets to come on down. I assure you, they'll buy you a T-bone steak every night. Okay? So the worst teams have the worst tight ends. Okay, I know you're saying, well, we thought that. I know. But where's that emphasis? Okay, where is the breakdown? People don't talk about that. They're too big into, well, this player is 5 inches more radius of his catch range, and he flips over to the X or the Y or the Z. I'll know, okay, what all that means. Okay, I can guess, but data and stats are where I live, so I'm sticking to my strengths. So tight ends. What about wide receivers here? Looks to me like we're going to see a big difference as well. Maybe even the best teams are going to produce the best wide receivers. So that's why I focused. It was a little harder to see on the landscape, but it looks like you're doing well here. Here's 107, and the worst team 68. So what is that? 32, 40 points a season. Seems to me, quarterback, wide receiver, what was it? Running back, tight end, is that the order? Anyway, you can look. It's either tight end, running back, or running back. So as far as what's critical in PPR, better grab that quarterback, better grab those wide receivers. Okay. Well, what about, I know, we all need a good running back, no doubt, to anchor our team. But don't forget wide receivers. And if you get from the best teams, you're going to have an advantage over some, not everybody, right? Because there's other teams and whatnot. Okay, so people will say, well, I'll take a wide receiver 1 from the worst team. Remember, this is looking at all wide receivers. So maybe that's true. I'll have to get into that maybe down the road. I may have actually got into that. We'll see. But right now, as a group, as a crew, I'm wanting wide receivers from the top 8 teams for 2021. I know. How do we predict it? Go see my lesson and start thinking about that. That's very critical. That's what I do and spend a lot of time thinking about. big time difference here. The p-value even stronger than what we've seen previous. And look at this, lo and behold, every group is different. So the wide receivers from the top 8 are better than everybody else. The wide receivers from above average are better than the below and the worst, etc. So there is the first time we have seen a clear hierarchy, and that occurs. Didn't even occur, I don't think, in the quarterback, but certainly in the wide receivers. Very intriguing. Love this kind of data. This really makes me happy. I think we get such an advantage if you think about in your draft sheet there. Think about who's going to be the worst teams this year. I think you can plan your strategy accordingly. Pretty neat. I'm excited about this. This is good stuff. Powerful stuff. Here is the top. Take a look. 85%, 73% of the top, 62% of the top. Notice the variation. Worst teams you get is pretty high uncertainty, but you're not getting any points for it, so it's not worth the risk. Okay, not worth your risk. Unless you gotta, they're sitting out there. I guess you can try a wide receiver one from the worst teams. I don't know. I'm looking maybe elsewhere. So that was my 10-cent tour of this. This was only part 3. I got 11 parts to this stuff. This is gold here, folks. I have panned the nuggets for you. You just got to sit back. I know. I'm trying to teach you how to chop the wood. Got that. But I've done some chopping for you. Okay, my treat. Okay, so we want you to crush your leagues, and hopefully you'll comment down the road. Nobody wants to comment and talk. I got that. We're all in the birds. But if you get a chance, did I help you, or Bush, you suck? Hey, that's fine. Then you'll know not to pay attention to me ever again, right? I get one shot at you. Here we go. Okay, this is the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. We're having lots of extra fun while everybody else is twisting around in the breeze. I'm actually looking at data and using that to my advantage, building my plans, planning and plotting to take their money. Okay, see ya.